Imagine this. You wake up one morning and discover that nearly 3 centuries of human history simply never happened. No Charlemagne crowned emperor in the year 800. No Carolingian Renaissance reviving art, law, and learning across Europe. No Viking raids along the Seine or the Rhine during the so-called Dark Ages. In fact, the entire period from 614 to 911 AD, almost 300 years, was quietly inserted into our calendars, our books, and our collective memory by a handful of medieval scholars with a hidden agenda. Sounds like the plot of a science fiction thriller, doesn't it? But this isn't fiction. It's a real historical theory, proposed by serious thinkers, debated in academic circles, and embraced by conspiracy enthusiasts around the world. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. And if it were true, everything we thought we knew about the early Middle Ages would collapse like a house of cards. Right now, you might be thinking, that's impossible. We have documents, buildings, artifacts. How could 300 years just vanish? And you'd be right to be skeptical. But that's exactly what makes this idea so compelling. It forces us to ask a deeper question. How do we really know what happened in the past? Is history a solid, unshakable record, or is it, at least in part, a story shaped by those who wrote it? Consider Charlemagne. To most of us, he's a towering figure, the king of the Franks, the first Holy Roman Emperor, a unifier of Western Europe after the fall of Rome. His court in Aachen was a beacon of culture in a supposedly dark and chaotic age. But what if Charlemagne never existed? Or worse, what if he did exist, but not when we think he did? What if his entire reign was retroactively placed into a timeline that had been artificially stretched to serve political or religious purposes? The implications are staggering. If those 300 years are phantom, then the Gregorian calendar is wrong. The year isn't 2025, it's closer to 1728. The Renaissance didn't follow a millennium of decline. It came much sooner after the fall of Rome. And the so-called Dark Ages might not have been dark at all, simply because they were far shorter than we've been taught. Now, before you dismiss this as wild speculation, consider this. History isn't just a list of facts carved in stone. It's reconstructed from fragments manuscripts copied centuries later, crumbling ruins, scattered coins, and oral traditions that evolved over time. Gaps exist, contradictions appear. And sometimes, the dates just don't add up. That's where the phantom time hypothesis steps in. It doesn't claim that nothing happened. Instead, it argues that a specific block of time was invented not out of malice, but to fulfill a symbolic vision of history. A vision where a Christian emperor would rule at the turn of the first millennium. A vision that required the calendar to be adjusted, records to be rewritten, and centuries to be conjured from thin air. Over the next hour, we're going to dive deep into this astonishing theory. We'll meet the man who proposed it. We'll examine the evidence he used: calendar quirks, missing documents, architectural puzzles. And then, we'll put that evidence to the test against astronomy, tree rings, carbon dating, and global historical records. By the end, you'll understand why mainstream historians overwhelmingly reject the phantom time hypothesis. But you'll also see why it continues to fascinate us. Because at its heart, this isn't really about missing centuries. It's about how we know what we know and whether the past is as fixed as we believe. So, did 300 years of history just vanish? Let's find out. So, what exactly is the phantom time hypothesis? At its core, it's a radical claim about the timeline of human history, specifically European history, between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the High Middle Ages. The theory asserts that roughly 297 years, spanning from AD 614 to AD 911, were never actually lived. Instead, they were inserted into historical records long after the fact, creating a phantom block of time that never existed. This means that if the hypothesis were true, our current year would not be 2025. It would be closer to 1728. The entire Carolingian dynasty, including the legendary Charlemagne, would either be fictional or dramatically misplaced in time. Major events like the founding of monasteries, the spread of Christianity across Germanic lands, and even the coronation of emperors in Rome would need to be redated or reinterpreted. But here's the crucial detail. The phantom time hypothesis is not a denial of history itself. It doesn't argue that nothing happened during the early medieval period. Rather, it claims that the chronology we accept today was deliberately altered. According to its proponents, this alteration was orchestrated in the late 10th and early 11th centuries by powerful figures who wanted to align earthly rule with divine symbolism. The key suspect, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. He reigned at the very end of the first millennium and was deeply influenced by apocalyptic and messianic ideas. Otto dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire under Christian rule, with himself as a new Constantine or even a second Christ. To fulfill this vision, the theory suggests, he and his close advisor Pope Sylvester II conspired to retroactively place their reign in the symbolic year 1000. To do that, they allegedly fabricated documents, rewrote chronicles, and added centuries to the calendar. This wasn't just about vanity. In medieval Europe, time was sacred. The year 1000 carried immense theological weight. It was seen by many as the possible end of the world, or the dawn of a new era. By anchoring his rule to that date, Otto could claim divine favor and legitimacy. But to make the math work, they needed to stretch the timeline backward. And so, the story goes, nearly 3 centuries were invented. It's important to understand that the phantom time hypothesis focuses almost entirely on Western Europe. It doesn't claim that the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, or Tang Dynasty China experienced phantom time. This creates an immediate problem, as we'll explore later, because if Europe skipped 300 years, but the rest of the world didn't, global historical records would be wildly out of sync. Yet they're not. Still, the idea is seductive in its simplicity. It offers a single explanation for what some see as historical inconsistencies: the scarcity of original documents from the so-called Dark Ages, the sudden appearance of Romanesque architecture, and puzzling gaps in technological progress. To believers, these aren't signs of a fragmented historical record, they're clues that time itself was tampered with. Of course, mainstream historians reject this theory outright. They point to overwhelming evidence from multiple independent fields, astronomy, archaeology, dendrochronology, and more, that firmly anchors the disputed period in reality. But the phantom time hypothesis persists, not because it's proven, but because it challenges a fundamental assumption that the past is fixed and knowable. In the next section, we'll meet the man who brought this theory into the modern spotlight, Heribert Illig, a German historian whose quiet skepticism sparked a global debate about the very nature of time and truth. To understand the phantom time hypothesis, we need to meet the man who turned it from a fringe curiosity into a full-fledged historical challenge. His name is Heribert Illig. Born in Germany in 1947, Illig was not a university professor or a tenured academic. Instead, he worked as a publisher, editor, and independent researcher with a deep fascination for historical methodology and the reliability of chronology. In the early 1992s, Illig began publishing articles and books that questioned the accepted timeline of the early Middle Ages. His most influential work, titled Das erfundene Mittelalter, or The Invented Middle Ages, was released in 1996. In it, he laid out a systematic case for what he called phantom time. He argued that the years between AD 614 and AD 911 were a historical fabrication, inserted into records centuries later to serve political and religious agendas. Illig was careful to position himself not as a conspiracy theorist, but as a critical thinker applying scientific skepticism to history. He pointed out what he saw as logical inconsistencies in medieval documents, architectural styles, and calendar calculations. For example, he noted that many so-called Carolingian manuscripts appeared stylistically identical to those from the 10th and 11th centuries, suggesting they might have been created at the same time, not centuries apart. He also collaborated with others who shared his doubts. One key ally was Hans Ulrich Niemitz, an engineer and former director of the Center for the History of Technology in Berlin. Niemitz brought a technical perspective to the debate, arguing that the lack of technological innovation during the Phantom Centuries was suspicious. Together, they published papers and gave lectures, slowly building a small but vocal school of thought in German-speaking academic circles. What set Illig apart was his tone. He didn't shout about secret cabals or global cover-ups. Instead, he spoke calmly, using footnotes, cross-references, and methodical reasoning. He framed his argument as a call for historical hygiene, a plea to re-examine foundational assumptions using modern tools of verification. In his view, history had become too reliant on circular reasoning. We know Charlemagne existed because the documents say so, and we trust the documents because they mention Charlemagne. Illig's background outside mainstream academia gave him both freedom and limitations. Freedom, because he wasn't bound by institutional orthodoxy. Limitations, because historians largely dismissed his work as amateurish, ignoring the vast body of archaeological and scientific evidence that contradicted his claims. Still, he gained a following. His books sold well in Germany, and his ideas spread through alternative history networks, eventually reaching global audiences via the internet. It's worth noting that Illig never claimed to have all the answers. He admitted gaps in his theory and invited further research. But he insisted that the burden of proof should lie with those defending the traditional timeline, not just with those questioning it. In his words, history must be falsifiable, or it is not science. Today, Heribert Illig remains a polarizing figure. To mainstream scholars, he's a cautionary tale about the dangers of cherry-picking evidence. To his supporters, he's a brave truth seeker who dared to ask, what if we've been counting time wrong? In the next section, we'll examine one of Illig's central arguments, the calendar conundrum, and see whether the math really adds up. One of the most compelling arguments put forward by Heribert Illig, and the one that often grabs people's attention first, is rooted in something we all use every day: the calendar. Specifically, the discrepancy between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. According to Illig, this seemingly minor adjustment hides a massive historical secret. Let's break it down. The Julian calendar was introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. It was a huge improvement over earlier systems, but it had a small flaw. It assumed a year was exactly 365.25 days long, when in reality, it's about 365.2422 days. That tiny difference, just 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year, might not seem like much, but over centuries, it adds up. By the late 16th century, that error had caused the calendar to drift significantly. The spring equinox, which was supposed to fall around March 21, had slipped to March 11. This was a serious problem for the Catholic Church, because the date of Easter is tied to the equinox. If the calendar kept drifting, Easter would eventually drift into summer. So, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a fix. The Gregorian calendar skipped 10 days October 4, was followed by October 15, and added new rules for leap years to prevent future drift. Now, here's where Illig saw a red flag. If the Julian calendar had been running continuously since 45 BCE, the drift should have been about 13 days by 1582, not 10. After all, more than 1,600 years had passed. Simple math suggests a larger correction was needed. Illig argued that this 3-day gap proves something is wrong with the timeline. His conclusion? Those missing 3 days represent roughly 300 years that never actually occurred. If you subtract 297 phantom years from the total, the math suddenly lines up. Only 10 days of correction would be needed. To Illig, this wasn't coincidence, it was evidence of deliberate chronological manipulation. At first glance, it sounds convincing. After all, calendars are precise tools. If the numbers don't add up, shouldn't we question the history behind them? But here's what Illig overlooked. The Julian calendar wasn't adopted uniformly across the Roman world right away. Different regions implemented it at different times. More importantly, the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is the true anchor point for Easter calculations, not 45 BCE. By 325, the calendar was already in use and the equinox was correctly aligned. So when Pope Gregory made his reform in 1582, he was correcting the drift that had accumulated since 325, not since Caesar's time. From 325 to 1,582 is about 1,257 years. At a drift rate of roughly 1 day every 128 years, that gives us about 9.8 days rounded up to 10. Perfectly consistent. No phantom centuries needed. Furthermore, astronomers and historians have long understood this nuance. The 10-day correction was never meant to account for the entire span since 45 BCE. It was specifically calibrated to restore the equinox to its Nicaean position. Illig's argument, while clever, rests on a misreading of how the Gregorian reform was actually designed. Still, the calendar conundrum remains a powerful hook. It turns an abstract historical debate into a tangible puzzle anyone can grasp. And that's part of why the phantom time hypothesis endures. It takes complex chronology and frames it as a simple math problem with a shocking answer. But as we'll see in the coming sections, calendars are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And when you bring in astronomy, tree rings, and global records, the phantom timeline begins to fade. Another pillar of the phantom time hypothesis is what Heribert Illig called the silence of the archives. He pointed out that original written records from the years 614 to 911 CE are extremely rare, especially in Western Europe. Most documents we associate with this era, like royal charters, legal codes, or religious texts, survive only as copies made centuries later. To Illig, this wasn't just a gap in preservation. It was a red flag suggesting those centuries might never have existed at all. He asked a simple but provocative question. If this was a period of major empires, church councils, and imperial coronations, why are there so few contemporary manuscripts? Where are the original letters of Charlemagne? Why do so many Carolingian texts appear in handwriting styles that closely resemble those of the 10th and 11th centuries? Illig argued that these weren't copies, they were forgeries or backdated creations produced during the time of Otto III to fill a fabricated past. At first glance, this concern seems reasonable. After all, historians rely heavily on primary sources. If those sources are missing or suspect, shouldn't we doubt the timeline? But here's the crucial context Illig downplayed: the material conditions of early medieval Europe. Parchment, the primary writing surface, was expensive, fragile, and often reused. Many documents were lost to fire, war, mold, or simple neglect. The Viking raids of the 8th and 9th centuries destroyed countless monasteries, which were the main centers of literacy and record-keeping. In a world with low literacy rates and limited bureaucratic infrastructure, it's not surprising that few original documents survived. Moreover, the idea that all later copies are fabrications ignores the consistency found across those texts. Thousands of manuscripts from different regions, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, contain overlapping names, dates, and events that align with archaeological findings. For example, the Royal Frankish Annals, though surviving in later copies, describe battles, eclipses, and royal successions that match independent evidence. We also have original documents that do date firmly to the disputed period. The Lorsch Codex, begun around 1100, but recording land grants from the 8th century, cross-references with charters verified by archaeology. More importantly, coins minted during Charlemagne's reign bear his name and image, and their metallurgical composition matches the era. These aren't texts, they're physical objects, stamped with dates and rulers that fit seamlessly into the accepted timeline. Then there's the issue of motive. If Otto III and Pope Sylvester II invented 300 years of history, they would have needed to coordinate with scribes across dozens of kingdoms, monasteries, and bishoprics, many of which were political rivals. They would have had to ensure that forged documents in Aachen matched those in Rome, Tours, and Canterbury. And they would have had to do this without leaving a single contradictory record or whistleblower account. The logistical challenge is staggering. Historians don't deny that medieval documents can be tricky. Dating them requires expertise in paleography, linguistics, and context. But the absence of originals doesn't prove non-existence. It reflects the harsh realities of survival over 1,200 years. In fact, the real wonder isn't that so few documents remain. It's that so many do. And when we compare them with archaeology, science, and global records, a consistent picture emerges, one that leaves little room for phantom centuries. So while the silence of the archives may seem eerie, it's not evidence of a conspiracy. It's a reminder of how fragile human memory truly is, and how diligently historians work to recover it. Another key argument used to support the phantom time hypothesis comes from the world of architecture. Heribert Illig and his followers pointed to what they saw as a jarring gap in building styles across early medieval Europe. Specifically, they noted that grand stone structures in the Romanesque style, characterized by thick walls, rounded arches, and sturdy pillars, seemed to appear suddenly in the 10th and 11th centuries, with no clear architectural ancestors in the preceding centuries. According to Illig, this abrupt emergence makes no sense if the so-called Dark Ages truly lasted 300 years. If skilled builders had been working continuously from the fall of Rome through the Carolingian era, we should see a gradual evolution from late Roman basilicas to early medieval churches, and then to mature Romanesque cathedrals. But instead, he argued, there's a void. No transitional buildings, no experimental designs, just silence, followed by fully formed stone architecture. To Illig, this wasn't a gap in the record. It was proof that the intervening centuries never happened. If you compress the timeline and remove the phantom years, then Romanesque architecture flows more naturally from late antiquity, making the supposed Dark Ages far shorter or even non-existent. At first glance, this observation seems compelling. After all, architecture is physical, visible, and hard to fake. If entire centuries of construction left no trace, shouldn't we question whether they occurred? But mainstream historians and archaeologists offer a different explanation, one rooted in materials, economics, and survival. The key point is this: most buildings in early medieval Europe weren't made of stone. They were built from wood, wattle, and thatch materials that decay within decades, especially in Europe's damp climate. Stone was expensive, labor-intensive, and reserved for only the most important religious or royal sites. So while grand Romanesque churches from the 1000s still stand today, the wooden halls of 7th century chieftains or 8th century monastic workshops have long since turned to dust. That doesn't mean they never existed, it just means they didn't survive. Moreover, we do have archaeological evidence of architectural continuity. Excavations at sites like the Monastery of Corvey in Germany or the Palace Complex in Aachen reveal stone structures dating firmly to the Carolingian period around the late 700 seconds and early 800 seconds. These buildings may be simpler than later cathedrals, but they show clear links to both Roman engineering and later Romanesque forms. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen, commissioned by Charlemagne, uses Roman columns and mosaics, blending classical heritage with emerging medieval styles. Even more telling are regional variations. In places like Ireland or Scandinavia, where stone was more commonly used for religious sites, we see continuous development throughout the disputed period. The round towers and high crosses of early medieval Ireland, for example, evolved stylistically across the 7th to 10th centuries without any sudden jumps. Illig's argument also overlooks the role of cultural disruption. The collapse of Roman infrastructure, the migration of peoples, and the fragmentation of political power did slow large-scale construction. But that's not the same as total stagnation. Monasteries preserved engineering knowledge. Local builders adapted techniques. And when stability returned under the Ottonians and later rulers, that knowledge was applied on a grander scale. So the Romanesque puzzle isn't a mystery that proves phantom time. It's a reflection of how history is preserved and how easily we mistake absence of evidence for evidence of absence. In the next section, we'll examine another claim, that technological progress ground to a halt during these centuries. But as we'll see, even in the so-called Dark Ages, innovation never truly stopped. One of the most persistent myths about the early Middle Ages is that it was a time of technological stagnation, a dark age where science, engineering, and invention came to a halt. Heribert Illig leaned into this idea, arguing that the lack of major innovations between the 7th and 10th centuries was suspicious. If nearly 300 years had truly passed, he reasoned, we should see clear signs of progress in tools, agriculture, or infrastructure. Instead, he claimed, farming methods, metalwork, and construction techniques appear almost unchanged from late Roman times to the year 1000. To Illig, this technological flatline wasn't just a sign of decline, it was evidence that the time period itself was fabricated. After all, how could 3 centuries pass without a single meaningful advance? But this view rests on an outdated and inaccurate picture of the early medieval world. Modern historians have long moved beyond the idea of a dark age defined by ignorance and inertia. In fact, the centuries between the fall of Rome and the High Middle Ages were far more dynamic than once believed. Take agriculture, for example. The heavy-wheeled plow, capable of turning the dense, wet soils of northern Europe, became widespread during the 8th and 9th centuries. This wasn't just a minor tweak, it revolutionized food production, allowing populations to grow and settlements to expand. Alongside it came the 3-field crop rotation system, which increased yields and soil fertility. Then there's the horse collar. Unlike the old throat harness used in Roman times, which choked animals under heavy loads, the padded horse collar, adopted in Europe by the 8th century, allowed horses to pull plows and carts far more efficiently. This simple innovation dramatically increased both farming output and transportation speed. In energy technology, watermills spread rapidly across the Frankish Empire during Charlemagne's reign. The Royal Frankish Annals even record Charlemagne ordering an inventory of watermills in 806, a clear sign they were economically significant. These mills didn't just grind grain. They powered bellows for iron forges, fulling cloth, and sawing wood. This was early industrialization, centuries before the Renaissance. Even in metallurgy, advances occurred. Archaeological finds show improved iron smelting techniques in the 8th and 9th centuries, leading to stronger tools and weapons. The Ulfbert sword's high-quality Viking blades, made from crucible steel, likely imported via trade routes from Central Asia, demonstrate sophisticated metallurgical knowledge circulating across Europe. And let's not forget knowledge preservation. Monasteries weren't just places of prayer, they were centers of learning, where classical texts were copied, studied, and sometimes expanded upon. The Carolingian Renaissance, sponsored by Charlemagne himself, revived Latin literacy, standardized scripts with Carolingian minuscule, and encouraged scholarship in astronomy, music, and theology. Illig's claim of stagnation also ignores the context of the time. Europe was politically fragmented, recovering from the collapse of Roman infrastructure and facing invasions from Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens. In such conditions, survival often took precedence over grand invention. But that doesn't mean innovation ceased, it just became more localized, practical, and incremental. So while the flashy breakthroughs of later centuries like the printing press or mechanical clocks were still far off, the foundations were being quietly laid. The so-called Dark Ages weren't dark at all. They were a period of adaptation, resilience, and slow but steady progress. And when we look beyond Europe to the Islamic world, China, and India, we see explosive innovation happening globally during these same centuries. That global context, as we'll explore next, delivers one of the strongest blows to the phantom time hypothesis. If there's one field that can settle a debate about time with near absolute certainty, it's astronomy. Unlike documents that can be lost or forged, or buildings that can decay, the movements of celestial bodies follow precise, unchanging laws. And when we look to the skies, the phantom time hypothesis collapses under the weight of the evidence. Heribert Illig's claim that 297 years never happened runs straight into a wall of astronomical data records of eclipses, comets, and supernovae that were observed and documented across the world during the very centuries he says are phantom. Take solar eclipses. These events can be calculated backward with extraordinary accuracy. Historians and astronomers have long used them to verify dates in ancient texts. For example, The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a total solar eclipse on August 12, 840 CE, visible across parts of Europe. Modern calculations confirm that a total eclipse did occur on that exact date, visible along the path described. If 300 years had been inserted into the timeline, that eclipse would appear 297 years too early in our records, and the math simply wouldn't match. Then there's Halley's Comet. This icy visitor returns to the inner solar system roughly every 76 years. Chinese astronomers, renowned for their meticulous skywatching, recorded its appearances in 240 BCE, 164 BCE, 87 BCE, and then consistently through the centuries, including in 760 CE and 837 CE. These dates align perfectly with modern orbital calculations. If the years between 614 and 911 were fictional, the 837 sighting would be impossible. The comet would not have been visible from Earth at that time. Even more dramatic is the supernova of 1054. Observed by Chinese, Japanese, and possibly ancestral Puebloan astronomers, this brilliant guest star remained visible in daylight for 23 days. Today, we know it created the Crab Nebula. By measuring the nebula's expansion rate, scientists have calculated that the explosion occurred around 960 years ago, placing it squarely in the mid-11th century. Again, this matches historical records exactly. What makes this evidence so powerful is its independence. These observations weren't made by European monks with possible motives to fabricate history. They were recorded by astronomers in China, the Islamic world, and the Americas civilizations with no reason to coordinate with Otto III or Pope Sylvester II. Yet their dates align seamlessly with the accepted European chronology. Illig and his supporters have tried to dismiss this by suggesting that later scribes retroactively inserted astronomical events into old texts. But that theory doesn't hold up. The Chinese imperial court kept continuous, detailed astronomical logs for over 2 millennia. These records include not just comets and eclipses, but planetary conjunctions, sunspot activity, and meteor showers, many of which can be independently verified today. Faking all of that across multiple cultures would require a global conspiracy of unimaginable scale. Moreover, Islamic astronomers during the 8th and 9th centuries were making groundbreaking advances in trigonometry and observational tools. Figures like Al-Fazari and later Al-Battani produced star catalogs and astronomical tables that only make sense if they were working within the accepted timeline. In short, the stars themselves testify against phantom time. The heavens don't lie, and they don't care about human agendas. Their silent, precise clockwork confirms that the years between 614 and 911 were very real. And if astronomy wasn't enough, another scientific method written in the rings of trees offers even more irrefutable proof. That's what we'll explore next. While documents can be forged and calendars adjusted, nature keeps its own record, one that is precise, unalterable, and written in wood. This record is called Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, and it provides one of the most powerful refutations of the phantom time hypothesis. Every year, a tree in a temperate climate adds a new growth ring. In wet, warm years, the ring is wide. In cold or dry years, it's narrow. This pattern creates a unique barcode of time, specific to a region and even to a particular decade. By overlapping the ring patterns of living trees with those of ancient timber, some preserved in bogs, buildings, or shipwrecks, scientists have built continuous tree ring chronologies that stretch back over 12,000 years. In Europe alone, the oak tree chronology extends continuously from the present day back to 10,472 BCE. That's more than 124 centuries of unbroken year-by-year data. And crucially, this timeline passes straight through the so-called phantom years of 614 to 911 CE without a single gap or inconsistency. Consider the Viking settlements in Greenland. Archaeologists have uncovered wooden structures from Norse farms that were abandoned in the 14th century. When scientists analyzed the tree rings in those beams, they found the outermost rings dated to the early 1300s, exactly when historical sources say the settlements declined. But more importantly, the inner rings connected seamlessly to earlier European chronologies, including wood from the 9th and 10th centuries. Then there's Charlemagne's Palatine Chapel in Aachen. Timber used in its construction has been dendrochronologically dated to the years 795 to 800 CE. Not 500, not 1100. Precisely the time when Charlemagne was alive and building his imperial capital. The tree rings match the historical record, and they span the very decades Illig claims never existed. Even more compelling are shipwrecks. The famous Nidum boat, found in Denmark and dated to around 310 CE, connects to later vessels like the Oseberg ship from Norway, whose timbers were felled in 800 CE. Between them lies a continuous sequence of wooden artifacts, tools, barrels, church beams, each dated by tree rings to specific years throughout the 600 seconds, 700 seconds, and 800 seconds. Illig's theory would require every single one of these samples to be misdated by exactly 297 years. But dendrochronology doesn't rely on assumptions about history. It relies on physical patterns in wood that can be cross-checked across thousands of samples from different locations. If 300 years were missing, the ring sequences would show a massive discontinuity, a gap where no matching patterns exist. But no such gap appears. Moreover, tree ring data aligns perfectly with other scientific methods. For example, spikes in atmospheric carbon-14 caused by cosmic ray events leave clear markers in tree rings. One such spike occurred in 774 CE and has been found in trees from Germany to Japan to New Zealand. This global signal anchors the entire timeline with atomic precision. Dendrochronology also helps date archaeological layers. At sites like Repton in England, where Vikings overwintered in 873 CE, wooden stakes and structural posts have been dated to the exact year through tree rings, corroborating both historical accounts and radiocarbon results. In essence, trees are silent historians. They don't care about emperors, popes, or calendar reforms. They simply grow, one ring at a time, recording the passage of real years. And their record is clear. The phantom centuries were not phantom at all. With this physical evidence in hand, the hypothesis begins to crumble. But the final nail in the coffin comes from yet another scientific method, one that measures time in atoms, not rings. That's radiocarbon dating, and we'll explore it next. If tree rings offer a year-by-year diary of the past, then radiocarbon dating provides a chemical clock embedded in every once living thing. This scientific method measures the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope absorbed by plants and animals during their lifetimes. When they die, the carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate, allowing scientists to calculate when the organism lived, often within a few decades of accuracy. For the phantom time hypothesis, this presents a serious problem. If the years 614 to 911 never happened, then organic materials from that period, bones, wood, cloth, seeds, should consistently date to the 4th or 5th century instead. But they don't. Across thousands of tests, radiocarbon results align remarkably well with the accepted historical timeline. Take the Viking Great Army, for example. Historical sources say this force invaded England in 865 CE and established a winter camp at Repton in 873. Excavations there uncovered human remains, animal bones, and wooden structures. Radiocarbon dating of those remains consistently places them in the late 9th century, right where history says they should be. There's no cluster of dates suddenly jumping back 300 years. Similarly, in Aachen, Germany, the remains of Charlemagne's palace complex have yielded organic material, charred grain, leather scraps, and textile fragments that carbon date to the late 700 seconds and early 800 seconds. These findings match both dendrochronology and historical records. If phantom time were real, these samples would be centuries older than they appear. Even more telling are calibration curves. Scientists don't rely on raw carbon-14 dates alone. They calibrate them using known records like tree rings and ice cores to correct for small fluctuations in atmospheric carbon over time. This process, called calibration, has been refined over decades and cross-verified globally. And every time, it confirms that the early medieval period fits exactly where we've always placed it. Archaeology adds another layer of confirmation. Excavations don't just uncover isolated objects, they reveal stratigraphy, or layers of human activity built up over time. At sites across Europe, from monasteries in Ireland to fortresses in France, archaeologists find clear sequences: Roman layers at the bottom, then early medieval layers with distinct pottery, tools, and coins, followed by high medieval layers on top. The artifacts in each layer match the expected time period in style, material, and technology. Coins are especially useful. Islamic dirhams, Byzantine solidi, and Carolingian deniers often bear rulers' names and mint dates. When found in archaeological contexts, like hoards buried during Viking raids, they provide fixed chronological anchors. A hoard buried in 860 CE might contain coins minted between 830 and 859. Radiocarbon dating of organic material in the same layer matches that window. There's no drift, no gap, no missing centuries. Critics of mainstream history sometimes claim that carbon dating is unreliable or easily manipulated, but the reality is that it's one of the most rigorously tested methods in science. Labs around the world follow strict protocols, and results are replicated independently. When combined with dendrochronology, stratigraphy, and historical records, it forms a web of evidence that's incredibly hard to falsify. And crucially, this evidence isn't confined to Europe. From Greenland to the Middle East, from Russia to North Africa, carbon-dated samples from the so-called Phantom Era all point to the same conclusion. Those years were real, lived, and documented, not invented. So while the phantom time hypothesis may sound intriguing in theory, it simply cannot survive contact with the physical past. The atoms themselves tell a different story, one of continuity, not conspiracy. But perhaps the most decisive evidence comes not from science alone, but from the rest of the world. Because while Europe may have been fragmented, it was never isolated. And that's what we'll explore next. One of the most fatal flaws in the phantom time hypothesis is that it treats Europe as if it existed in a vacuum. Heribert Illig focused almost entirely on Western European records, assuming that if those were fabricated, the timeline could be rewritten. But history doesn't work that way. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was deeply connected to a vast network of civilizations, from the Byzantine Empire in the east, to the Islamic caliphates in the south, to the Tang dynasty in China and beyond. And all of them kept detailed, independent records that align perfectly with the so-called phantom centuries. Take the Byzantine Empire. While Western Europe fragmented after Rome's fall, Constantinople remained a thriving center of power, culture, and record-keeping. Byzantine historians like Theophanes the Confessor chronicled events year by year throughout the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, recording wars with the Arabs, internal religious conflicts, and diplomatic exchanges with the Franks. These accounts mention Charlemagne by name, describe his coronation in 800, and even note the exchange of ambassadors. If those years never happened, the entire Byzantine chronology would be off, but it isn't. Their dates match astronomical events, coinage, and archaeological layers with remarkable precision. Then there's the Islamic world. The Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates were at the height of their power during the disputed period. Scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba produced encyclopedic works on history, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. The famous historian al-Tabari, writing in the early 10th century, compiled a universal history that includes detailed timelines of events from the 7th century onward, including the rise of Islam, the conquest of Spain in 711, and battles with the Byzantines and Franks. These records correspond with Christian sources, Persian texts, and even Chinese annals. Speaking of China, the Tang dynasty ruled from 618 to 907, a period of extraordinary cultural and technological flourishing. Chinese court historians maintained meticulous records of celestial events, foreign envoys, and military campaigns. They document the Battle of Talas in 751, where Tang forces clashed with the Abbasid Caliphate in Central Asia, a pivotal moment that halted Chinese westward expansion and facilitated the spread of papermaking to the Islamic world. This single event is recorded in Chinese, Arabic, and later Persian sources, all agreeing on the date and outcome. Even trade confirms the timeline. Archaeologists have found Islamic coins from the 8th and 9th centuries in Viking hoards in Sweden and Chinese silk in Frankish graves. The famous Silk Road wasn't just a myth, it was a real network of exchange, with goods, ideas, and people moving across continents. These interactions left traces that can be dated through multiple methods, and none suggest a 300-year gap. If Europe had skipped 297 years while the rest of the world marched on, we would see massive contradictions. Byzantine emperors would be ruling centuries out of sync with Islamic caliphs. Chinese records of comets would clash with European ones. Trade goods would appear in impossible contexts. But instead, we find a coherent, interlocking global timeline. The phantom time hypothesis simply cannot explain how a small group of medieval scribes could have rewritten not just European history, but coordinated with chroniclers across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East without leaving a single anachronism or mismatched date. In reality, the world was watching, and its collective memory confirms that the years between 614 and 911 were very much real. Even if the evidence strongly contradicts it, the phantom time hypothesis still raises a fascinating question. Why would anyone go to such extreme lengths to invent nearly 300 years of history? Heribert Illig proposed a specific motive and a surprisingly small group of conspirators. At the heart of his theory stands Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, who ruled from 983 to 1002, and his close advisor Pope Sylvester II. According to Illig, Otto was obsessed with the symbolic power of the year 1000. Deeply influenced by apocalyptic theology and the legacy of Rome, he dreamed of restoring the Christian Roman Empire with himself as its divine ruler. To fulfill this vision, he allegedly needed to place his reign precisely at the turn of the millennium. But if the true year was closer to 700, not 1000, he would have to stretch the timeline backward. So, Illig argued, Otto and Sylvester II orchestrated a quiet but sweeping revision of history. They supposedly fabricated documents, rewrote chronicles, and inserted fictional rulers and events into the past, creating the Carolingian dynasty, inflating the reigns of earlier popes, and even inventing Charlemagne as a proto-imperial figure to legitimize Otto's own rule. On the surface, this sounds like a classic historical conspiracy. Powerful men reshaping the past to serve present ambitions. And it's true that medieval rulers often manipulated history. Genealogies were embellished, victories exaggerated, and rivals erased from records. But fabricating 297 entire years is a different matter altogether. Consider the scale of what would be required. To make phantom time believable, Otto and his circle would have needed to alter not just a few royal charters, but thousands of documents across dozens of monasteries, bishoprics, and royal courts from Ireland to Italy, from Spain to Saxony. They would have had to ensure that forged land grants in France matched property records in Germany, that liturgical calendars in Rome aligned with feast days in Canterbury, that coinage, architecture, and even agricultural cycles all told the same false story. And they would have had to do this without leaving a single contradictory account. No monk questioning the sudden appearance of new saints, no chronicler noting that the reigns of kings didn't add up, no merchant confused by mismatched trade records. In an age before printing presses or centralized control, this level of coordination is virtually impossible. Moreover, there's no evidence that Otto III or Sylvester II ever claimed to be living in the year 1000 as a theological milestone in the way Illig suggests. While the year 1000 did carry symbolic weight, most medieval scholars actually believed the millennium had already passed, or that the exact date of Christ's return was unknowable. The idea of a widespread millennial panic is largely a modern myth. Even more telling, if Otto had truly invented Charlemagne, why would he base his own legitimacy on a figure who lived just 200 years earlier, not 500? A more distant, legendary founder would have been far more useful for myth-making. In short, the motive is speculative, the method implausible, and the historical record silent on any such conspiracy. While medieval rulers certainly shaped narratives, they didn't rewrite time itself. The phantom time hypothesis mistakes selective storytelling for total fabrication and underestimates both the chaos and the resilience of the historical record. But this brings us to an important distinction between fringe theories like Illig's and the real legitimate debates that historians actually have about the past. That's what we'll explore next. It's important to recognize that questioning history isn't inherently wrong. In fact, healthy skepticism is the engine of historical progress. Scholars constantly re-examine sources, challenge old assumptions, and revise timelines based on new evidence. But there's a crucial difference between legitimate historical debate and fringe theories like the phantom time hypothesis. Real historical revision happens within a framework of evidence, peer review, and methodological rigor. For example, historians once described the early Middle Ages as a dark age of ignorance and decline. But over the past 50 years, archaeology, manuscript studies, and interdisciplinary research have transformed that view. We now understand this era as one of adaptation, cultural fusion, and quiet innovation. This wasn't a rejection of history, it was a refinement of it, based on new data. Similarly, scholars debate the exact dates of events like the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Was it 476, when the last emperor was deposed, or 480, when his successor died? Or even later, when Roman institutions fully disappeared in certain regions? These are nuanced discussions about interpretation, not claims that entire centuries vanished. Another active area of research involves the reliability of medieval chronicles. Historians know that many were written decades or centuries after the events they describe, often with political or religious agendas. So they cross-check them against coins, legal records, burial sites, and scientific dating. This careful triangulation is how history advances, not by discarding evidence, but by testing it. The phantom time hypothesis, by contrast, doesn't engage with this process. It starts with a conclusion that 297 years are missing, and then selectively interprets or dismisses any evidence that contradicts it. When dendrochronology, carbon dating, and global records all confirm the traditional timeline, proponents often respond by claiming those methods are part of the same fabricated system. This is a classic hallmark of pseudo-history, moving the goalposts to avoid falsification. Compare this to more credible alternative chronologies, like those proposed by scholars studying ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. In those fields, debates about king lists or regnal years are grounded in physical artifacts, linguistic analysis, and astronomical data. Even when timelines shift by decades, they do so incrementally and transparently. Illig's theory also ignores the collaborative nature of historical research. Thousands of scholars across dozens of countries working in different languages with different specialties have independently verified the early medieval timeline through countless studies. Their consensus isn't dogma. It's the result of repeated testing, failed attempts to disprove it, and convergence across disciplines. That doesn't mean historians are infallible. They've been wrong before about the extent of Viking exploration, the sophistication of pre-Columbian societies, or the role of women in medieval economies. But each correction came from within the system, using better evidence, not by erasing centuries. The phantom time hypothesis, in the end, confuses mystery with fraud. Just because some parts of the past are unclear, doesn't mean they were invented. Gaps in the record reflect the fragility of human memory, not a grand deception. So, while it's exciting to imagine secret timelines and hidden centuries, real history is far more fascinating. It's a detective story built on fragments, verified by science, and constantly evolving not through conspiracy, but through curiosity, rigor, and collaboration. And that brings us to a deeper question. If the theory is so thoroughly debunked, why does it still capture our imagination? That's what we'll explore next. If the phantom time hypothesis has been so thoroughly refuted by science and scholarship, why does it still resonate with so many people? The answer lies not in the evidence, but in human psychology, storytelling, and the way information spreads in the digital age. At its core, the theory taps into a powerful and timeless desire, the thrill of uncovering a hidden truth. We all love the idea that the official story is a lie, and that a lone thinker armed only with logic and courage can expose a grand deception. It's the same appeal that drives interest in lost civilizations, secret societies, and alternative histories. The phantom time hypothesis offers a clean, dramatic narrative. Time itself was stolen, and only the vigilant can see it. This is especially compelling in an era of widespread distrust in institutions. Governments, media, and even academia are often viewed with skepticism. In that climate, a theory that claims they've been lying to you about history feels less like fantasy and more like revelation. It transforms the viewer from a passive learner into an active truth seeker. Pop culture has amplified this effect. From novels like The Da Vinci Code to documentaries about ancient aliens, modern entertainment thrives on rewriting the past. YouTube and social media have supercharged this trend. Algorithms favor content that surprises, shocks, or challenges consensus, making fringe ideas like phantom time appear more credible simply because they're presented with dramatic music, slick graphics, and confident narration. And let's be honest, the theory is intellectually seductive. It starts with a real observation, the scarcity of early medieval documents, and builds a bold explanation. It uses logic, math, and historical references, giving it the surface appearance of scholarship. To someone without training in Dendrochronology or Byzantine chronicles, it can sound perfectly reasonable. But there's another reason the idea endures. It makes history feel alive, mysterious, and unfinished. Mainstream history can sometimes seem dry or settled, just a list of names and dates. The phantom time hypothesis reopens the door to wonder. It asks, what if we're wrong? And that question, even when based on a false premise, can spark genuine curiosity about the past. In fact, many people who first encounter the theory go on to explore real medieval history, reading about Charlemagne, studying Viking archaeology, or learning how carbon dating works. In that sense, even a debunked idea can serve as a gateway to deeper understanding, as long as it's met with critical context. The danger comes when the line between speculation and fact blurs. When viewers walk away believing that historians are hiding the truth or that science is part of the cover-up, the theory stops being a thought experiment and becomes misinformation. But we shouldn't dismiss believers as foolish. Instead, we should recognize what they're really seeking: agency, meaning, and a sense that the world still holds secrets. The best response isn't mockery, it's offering a better story. One where the truth is even more astonishing than the myth. Because the real wonder isn't that 300 years were erased. It's that, despite war, decay, and time itself, we can still reconstruct the past with such astonishing accuracy, using tree rings, starlight, and fragments of parchment. And that brings us to our final reflection on time, truth, and how we know what really happened. So, did 300 years of history just vanish? After exploring the phantom time hypothesis from every angle, the calendar quirks, the missing documents, the architecture, the science, and the global record, the answer is clear: no. Those centuries were real. People lived, built, fought, wrote, and died. In the years between 614 and 911 CE, Charlemagne ruled, Vikings raided, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, and the stars moved across the sky just as they do today. The phantom time hypothesis, for all its intrigue, collapses under the weight of evidence. Astronomy confirms the timeline with celestial precision. Tree rings provide an unbroken annual record stretching back millennia. Radiocarbon dating, archaeology, and global historical sources all converge on the same conclusion. There is no gap, no conspiracy, no phantom centuries. But that doesn't mean this journey was pointless. On the contrary, examining fringe theories like this one teaches us something vital about how knowledge works. History isn't just a list of facts handed down from on high. It's a reconstruction built from fragments, tested across disciplines, and constantly refined. The fact that we can verify the past through tree rings, star positions, and Chinese court records is a triumph of human curiosity and collaboration. It also reminds us to think critically. Not everything that sounds logical is true. Not every gap in the record is proof of fraud. And just because a theory is bold doesn't mean it's right. Real understanding comes from following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts a captivating story. That said, we should also appreciate why ideas like this capture our imagination. They speak to a deep human need, to question, to wonder, to believe that the world still holds secrets. And in a way, it does. History is full of mysteries, not because time was erased, but because the past is vast, complex, and only partially preserved. Every excavation, every decoded manuscript, every calibrated carbon date adds another piece to the puzzle. So rather than mourning phantom centuries, we can celebrate the real ones. The resilience of a monk preserving knowledge in a stormy Northumbrian monastery. The ingenuity of a blacksmith forging a better plow. The courage of a trader crossing deserts with silk and spices. These stories don't need fabrication to be remarkable. They're extraordinary because they're true. As we close, consider this. The greatest threat to history isn't wild theories like Illig's. It's indifference. It's assuming the past is fixed, boring, or irrelevant. But the past is alive in our laws, our languages, our landscapes, and understanding it honestly, rigorously, and with humility is one of the most important things we can do. Thank you for joining this deep dive into one of history's most provocative puzzles. If you found this exploration valuable, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think any part of history might still be misunderstood? What other mysteries should we investigate next? Until then, keep questioning, but always follow the evidence, because in the end, the truth is stranger, richer, and far more inspiring than any phantom.